Well, one of my very earliest recollections, I was born in 1907, and my very earliest recollection is being in London in very old dwellings, well, very old cottages that were in London, turning off Old Kent Road, Walworth. It was my grandmother's house. And I can remember distinctly as a kiddie that I must have been only about 3 years old, I suppose, toddling somewhere. I've got no recollections before that time, but I know that I was toddling, and we went round to an off-licence or round to a shop to get some stuff, and my uncle took me and brought me back, carrying me in a sort of what we used to call a flying angel in those days, or later I knew to be a flying angel. With your legs on your shoulders, with your legs hanging down, you see. Anyway, I also recollect him taking me, or my father taking me, to see the horse buses that were then more or less going out of existence. That was at Thomas Tilling's. That was only when I was about 3 or 4 years old. That was at Thomas Tilling's at Peckham. They had a big garage there where the horse buses used to go in and out from.
Where were you living?
Well, in those early days, I can recollect we were living down at Beddington Corner, a place called Beddington Corner, which was down beyond Mitcham in Surrey. And my father was then working at a leather tannery, grainers and tanners, I suppose they would be called. My father was working as a leather grainer at a firm called Louis Dawes, which was in the middle of on the banks of the Wandle, in the middle of a big orchard area, and sort of more or less cultivated land, where that now, I believe, the last time I was there some few years ago, Mullards, the radio and wireless people, and that, they bought up the whole of the ground, and they have their workplace down there now. Well, I'm the oldest in the family. I was the firstborn. I was the firstborn of what eventually turned out to be, as the family progressed, 8 children. I had a brother, James, that was a year and 5 months younger than me. A sister, Florence, who's still alive, who is somewhere in the region of 4 years younger than me.
She's not called Florence.
Pardon?
She's not called Florence.
No, so we always nicknamed her Sis.
How was that from?
Well, because she was Sis, I suppose. I don't know how that works out, but it was always known as Sis. She was always known as Sis to everybody. Her name actually was Florence Harriet. My mother's name was Harriet, and I don't think she really liked the Harriet side of it, because it's never ever been used all through her life, to my knowledge. Nobody I know has ever really called her Harriet, only in fun. Then the next one was my sister Ivy, who would be then, I suppose, I don't know, she's in the region of 65, I should imagine. 65, 66. Then my brother George, who is 64, there was, then my brother Alf, Alfred, who is 15 years younger than me. There was a brother Bertie, who would have been about 17 years younger than me, and my sister Joyce, who was the baby of the family and would be in the region of 18 or 19 years younger than me, I should think. Anyway, to get back to my recollections, I also remember my father in our young days, when we were about before the war broke out, and that actually broke out when I was 7 years old, the First World War. My father used to take us every Sunday morning a walk from Beddington Corner to Mitcham. My brother and myself, I think we were the only two possibly that could walk or get around in those days. The only two out of, there may have been three born at that particular time. Anyway, I can often recollect doing childish things, such as I remember once being dressed in a velvet suit with long brown stockings and going scrumping up, and climbed up the apple tree, and as I came down I split all my velvet suit and my stockings, and when I got home I got a terrific belting from my father. My father was, I won't say he was a very strong man, in as much as he ruled us to a certain extent, very forcefully. He always gave me a belt. He had a leather belt round his waist that was like a fireman's belt. Had the old-fashioned ones that used to be with a brass buckle, knitted like a pair of snakes entwined. And he used to take that off and allow at me for any, what he called serious infringements, things that was very serious. And although I'm the only one that I think that ever felt the weight of his belt, I don't recollect him belting anybody else. He belted me on 3 particular occasions that I remember quite distinctly. One was when I slid down this apple tree and tore my stockings. Another time was when I threw a stone through a window of a neighbour's house and broke the window, and my father then was on very bad times, and in those days it was incumbent on you replacing the window and paying for it. I got a belting for that one. And another one, I'd been chasing what I now know as stag beetles, but in my days we had cockchafers, they're called, I suppose, a nickname for them. And I was chasing these, or throwing bits of stick up at them by an old school that I used to go to near Hackbridge. This was in my schooling days. And came home rather late. I suppose it must have been somewhere around about 6 o'clock on a summer's evening, and they'd worried where I got to, and I really got a severe belting for that also. On one occasion, I remember, one of my earliest recollections is we used to have to go rather a long way to school. From Beddington, there was a small school I'm not sure whether it still exists, at a place called Hackbridge, and it was quite a long walk. And we used to go every morning there, and it was very old-fashioned. There was no, I know now that it's all houses and estates all built round it, but there was nothing there then. It was all put aside of what were millers' orchards, and we walked along, and there was ditches along the side of the road. I recollect once in that particular time seeing the Zeppelin, the R101. It wasn't actually a Zeppelin, it was an airship. I saw Zeppelins later after the war, when the war broke out. But anyway, carry on with the story as it is up till now. We used to go on a Saturday morning, we used to go to a small place in Wallington that showed, I think it was in those days, magic lanterns, or possibly at the very early beginnings of the cinema. And we used to go into these places on a Saturday morning. Kiddies used to be charged either a halfpenny or a penny. I can't say which it was then and now, but I know it was very, very cheap, and we used to go there every Saturday morning. Again, the long walk, which I recollect quite well. When war broke out, which was at 1914, August 1914, although my father still worked at Louis Dawes, we moved up from Bennington Corner to Tooting, and first lived in number 30 Ascot Road, Tooting, which is by Tooting Junction. And I went then, I recollect myself and my younger brother, and perhaps my sister, younger sister then, going to Links Road School. First starting, that was my first really recollection of any real education as far as schools were concerned. I seem to remember that then I became ambitious to be. We used to have exams every year, and I first became ambitious to be top of the form and that sort of thing. But I could have only been about 7 or 8 or so. When I say that it was my first recollection of a real sort of serious education was when I came to Links Road School. I have no recollection, although I know that I went to Hackbridge School. Must have started there when I was 4 or 5. I must have started there when I was 5 years old at the very latest, because it was a compulsory to go to school when you were 5. I believe it still is. Anyway, I have no recollection of real education in any way until I came to Links Road School, where I suppose I must have advanced to a certain extent. I must have had a reasonable part of my early education at Hackbridge, because in a very short time I was top of the class, and in my earliest examinations of 8 or 9 and all that sort of thing, I can recollect that I was top of the class at school, or second or third, always in the first 3 in that sort of capacity. The only thing that really let me down was writing. I was never any good. I never have been able to a good hand at writing things. I was all okay at arithmetic, composition, all sorts of things of that description. Religious knowledge, I know we used to have and I won the Bible on 2 occasions at school when I was at school, with during my schooling, which was accredited sort of best in the school, religious knowledge. But I must have left. We must have left. I must have only been a couple of years or 3 years at Links Road School, because my next recollection is that we moved to Sellingcourt Road, Tooting, and I went to Sellingcourt Road School. We lived at number 51 Sellingcourt Road, and I went to school. 51 Sellingcourt Road was a flat. By that time, or earlier on, I recollect, my father and at that time we had 3 of my mother's brothers were actually living with us, and although when we had the house we had a house in Ascot Road, and 3 of my mother's brothers were living with us. But when war broke out, I remember distinctly that just previous to the war breaking out, every one of them had a suit of exactly the same colour, which seems now to me seems very strange. But my father and the 3 brothers, whether they got them made cheaply or whatever it was, I don't know, but they had a herringbone brown tweed suit made, and each one of them had the suits at the same time. I can recollect quite distinctly seeing them all in them. My father at that time was a big and powerful man and had a big ginger moustache. But anyway, in a very short time after the war started, they all either volunteered or enlisted in the army. And I suppose now I think about it, they were possibly called up very quickly. I think everybody was called up that was able to do anything like that in those days, called up quickly and sent out to France. My father went to Suvla Bay, Dardanelles and Suvla Bay, and around that area, and often spoke about those particular areas to me later in life. But my 3 uncles all went to France. That was at Sellingcourt, actually, when I, carried on and won that sort of thing. Anyway, during my schooling at, which is the most, the part of my life as far as education was concerned that imprinted most on my memory was Sellingcourt Road School. It was.
How old were you when you went there?
I must have gone there when I was about 9, I think.
And why was that? Because you moved?
Yes, I've already said that we moved. We moved from Links Road to Sellingcourt Road, and I went to Sellingcourt Road School. If I remember rightly, the headmaster that I knew, that I recollect most, was a man named Muckle, and the masters that I remember and recollect mostly were Mr. Nibbs, who was the 7th form master, Mr. Ainsworth, who would be the 6th form master, I should think, and Mr. Smoker, who would be the 5th form master. All those were individuals I remember quite well. They all had, I remember distinctly, Mr. Nibbs had most impression on my life. He tried to encourage me to go in for further education under his guidance, which, although I tried to and tempted to do, I found a little bit irksome, because also I was the eldest of 8 children, probably by that time. No, not by that time, but we had 4 or 5, must have done, around that time, and my mother wasn't in extra good health, although she seemed strong and that, she wasn't in extra good health, and I used to do a hell of a lot of housework. In those days, I would scrub the floors and, I know, clean the knives and forks, do all the...
Willingly?
Oh yeah, brass work. I used to do a hell of a lot of housework.
Without being asked?
Yeah, my mother used to think I was marvellous. My mother always did. But I used to love to... I've cleaned the house through, which was a flat, I mean, Selling Court Road, many and many a time. And then later we moved to another part, and I also recollect we must have moved from Selling Court Road. I remember in early part of 1917, my mother had a bad attack of pleurisy and pneumonia, was taken to hospital, and myself with 3 other children, that's my next brother James, my sister Florence, and my brother George, were sent up to live in Peckham with an aunt, one of my father's sisters, I believe, or one of my father's brother's wives. And it's there that I first encountered any drinking, drunkenness or anything like that. My father and mother, although they probably, I know in later life I knew them as they liked to have just the odd drink or so. My mother used to like to have a couple of Guinnesses every day. But this aunt that we were taken to lived right next door to a public house and spent most of her time in the public house. So it was, and as it was wartime, rationing was on, and we had a very miserable sort of existence, I recollect, during that time. We were never ever allowed to have more than 3 thin slices of bread at any one meal, and never ever had, which my mother always tried to, my mother when she was looking after us always tried to do the best she can, although she was also very poor, but she could make, one of these women that could make a meal out of a few scraps practically. But the woman where we went to, stayed at this particular time, had no knowledge of anything like that, and just gave us bread and butter, bread and margarine and jam, or just bread and jam, or whatever it was.
How poor was your family?
Oh, very poor. My father...
Compared with other people at that time?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say compared with other people, in as much as in those days it was my coming to London and going to school at London. I saw poverty then that I hadn't really seen in my own life before. I suppose the standard seemed to be a little bit better in the outlying districts.
Can you describe the poverty that you saw?
Well,
what did it consist of?
Well, you saw not one but dozens of kids at a school of the size of the elementary schools of those days. You saw dozens of kids with no shoes on their feet, walking about with their feet, bare feet, and
In the winter?
all times practically. Saw dozens of them with their backside out of their trousers, or it was the custom then to have hand-me-downs and You always, whenever any suit or trousers or jersey or anything like that was finished by one of the other brothers or one of the family growing out of it, it was always handed down to the next person in the family in those days.
And was it considered poor if you had no shoes?
Well, of course it was. Yes. Oh, yes. But you saw a hell of a lot of it,
But you never went through that?
no, I could never recollect going without shoes or anything like that. Never in my life, or any of my family. We were able to maintain that little bit better than that sort of standard. Although I can recollect during the war, that during the first 1914-18 war, things were very short. Rationing was in existence and things were very short, and you had to line up for half a pound of margarine. You maybe had to line up for a couple of hours for half a pound of margarine for the family, or line up for bread. You had to go and line up and find out where they were selling bread or where bread was being made, and go and line up for it to buy it. Also, coal was another thing that was very scarce, and you had to go and line up to obtain that. Also, potatoes. Potatoes were very scarce, and you had to line up to get them. Sugar was another thing that was everyone. You had to line up if you wanted to get it. You went all over the place. Nothing to go miles. If you heard that a shop in the district was selling butter or sugar or whatever it was that you were short of, if you could get that little bit extra or get enough to carry on with, you went and lined up for it. I know that I did on many and many occasions as a youngster.
Would you say that your family was just an ordinary working class family?
Yes.
So how was it that your family didn't suffer the poverty that these other people have described?
Well, I can only say that my father was in more or less regular work. He was a grainer by profession, by trade, and I suppose he just secured that little bit extra, little bit more a week, and he was mainly in regular work. A hard worker, I know. He used to mend all our shoes, come home and have a last, and I know at least one night a week he'd be sitting mending shoes. Another night a week or another night every so often he used to cut all our hairs. I never ever recollect going to a barber when I was a young lad of that age. When I was at school, my father always cut my hair for me.
What things did your mother do in order to make ends meet? Can you think of any?
Well, things that wouldn't exist today. My mother could go up to a fishmonger's and buy a couple of cod's heads and come home and make a meal for all of us out of 2 cod's heads or 3 cod's heads, perhaps, something like that. She'd make a meal out of a few faggots. All sorts of things.
Did you ever take work in or go out to work?
Not to my recollection. In those days, I mean, having a large family, and this is well before sliced bread was ever invented, a mother cut up every slice of bread that was eaten by the family, and that in itself was, when there was, as eventually turned out, there was 8 children, that in itself was always a pretty busy number. And the washing, there were no washing machines. That used to have a copper that you stoked up, and no ways of drying. If it was a sultry, wet week, the washing used to hang about in the house for seemingly a week. before it was all dried. And then your mother would do all the ironing and all the mangling. We used to have big mangles then, big roller presses that we called mangles, and I used to have to turn, or one of us who was available, turn the mangle for my mother while she put everything all through it.
Now, how on earth did she manage to get through the washing and ironing for 8 people? It seems impossible.
I know, but that's how it was. That's what I say. When you say, "What didn't she go out to work?" She always had enough to do with her work herself. I can never remember times she walked down the road and did the shopping, and because there was no ways of getting it in then. You had to go down the road and get the shopping, or one or two of us would. I mostly be running errands for her. But I remember at about 12 years old, when I became about 12, I secured a paper round. I don't think I got much for it, about 3 half-a-crowns a week or something like that. But it,
As much as that?
yeah, you would do.
That's
yeah.
more than I got when I started.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, I think I got some. I think I remember getting 7 or 6 a week. I was as a youngster. I used to work night and morning, mind you. Used to work, but it was an hour each morning and about half an hour in the evening time. Not much more than half an hour. But and the newspaper man that I worked for, a man named David Godwin, was always very kind to me. Yeah. Well, I can't. Seemingly, it seems a bit doleful, my story, but my early recollections. But I don't remember many comical or interesting incidents that happened during my time at school. I suppose there must have been quite a number, but I can't seem to recollect many of them. We had some very interesting times during the course of the war. Of course, air raids came to London then. The first German daylight air raid that I recollect. We'd had Zeppelins previously to that. But
you'd seen some?
Yeah, I'd seen several of them. And
what do they look like?
Well, like a big airship, you know, they're big, massive airships. But
how did you feel?
I don't remember ever being able to see the first Zeppelin that was brought down at Cuffley by, I think his name was Flight Lieutenant Robinson in those days. I can't, we were too far away to actually see it, but we knew that it had actually happened. On the very first daylight raid that I can recollect on London, I'd been told by my mother, it was a Saturday morning, and after finishing the chores and things that I had to do, she asked me if I would take the children out the way and go down to a recreation ground that was about half a mile or so from where we lived. I took the children along to this recreation ground, I believe 2 or 3 of them, and whilst we're on this recreation ground, in the middle of it, I believe there was 25, what they called Taubes, a German aeroplane, made their first daylight raid on London. And that was on a Saturday morning, I would think in 1917 or 18, early 18. But possibly it could have been a little bit earlier, but I should think early 17 or 18.
Well, did you see any of this?
Yeah, we saw these planes come out of the sky, so distinct it just wasn't true, and immediately the sirens had gone for a raid, and we made our way as fast as we could home to our mother. But
What do they look like, the planes?
we're just a group of tiny aeroplanes coming out of the cloud sort of.
Monoplanes?
I couldn't tell you whether they were monoplanes or biplanes then. I think they were monoplanes, I don't know for sure. I mean, in those days, I don't suppose there was many monoplanes, were there? Not so many anyway. I don't know what the talks were. But anyway, and made our way home. I remember if there was raids at night time, we used to go, in those days, the main streets of London were wooden blocked. Main streets of London were all had wooden blocks just like bricks. And of course in those days tramways and tram lines all down in the centre of the road, but the sides of the road, and we would go chipping away at these wooden blocks. If any nut or screw or anything that we found was always considered a souvenir, a part of a bomb or something like that, and we used to consider that they were souvenirs and take them home.
Did you see any actual bomb sites?
Oh yeah, saw one or two places. The first bomb that was dropped anywhere, well, more or less anywhere near us, was in Balham, in Romberg Road, Balham, where a lad who was, so the story went, who was just going out to blow the all clear, and he was a bugler, and the bomb fell on his house and killed him before he. So we heard. But in those days, there used to be sirens sound to start the siren sounded to start at the start of the air raid, and bugles were blown by volunteers walking around the streets blowing bugles when the all clear sounded.
The police had something to do with it.
Well, I suppose they had something to do with it, but I think it was mostly done by volunteer scouts and things like that.
Were you a scout?
No, not that I recollect.
Can you remember when the war began? The events, any of the events leading up to it, or did it just, as you recollect, just sort of start?
Well, I don't remember. Of course, later I've seen what happened to a certain extent at Sarajevo, where I believe, I can't recollect now, but someone was assassinated. And the war started more or less straight away. But I know that in those days it was Kaiser Bill was the leader of the German forces, and he was always painted as a terrible picture, just as we now later events showed that Hitler was too.
So you don't actually remember this war beginning?
No, I don't actually remember it beginning there. To a certain extent it started. My recollections of it are a bit hazy. Only in as much as I remember my father joining up and that sort of thing with it. But
did he join, or was he conscripted?
I think he was called up. I think he volunteered. I don't know for sure.
And most families, of course, had a terrible experience with that war.
Oh yes, that war impressed us more than any other war because, I don't know more than any other war. We got most of it. We got bombing in London and other parts of the country, but not anywhere near to the extent that it happened during the Second World War. But we did get a bombing in London, but all of us, every one of us, had someone that was out in the trenches, as they were known. The trenches in France and the battles in France were terrible as far as we were concerned. But
did you know this at the time?
Oh yeah, you knew that what was going on was very bad, you know. that our chaps were, oftentimes our chaps were getting beaten. It was sort of a backwards and forwards movement, all sort of taking place over a matter of 200 or 300 yards and all that sort of thing.
Were you aware of the terrible conditions they were fighting?
Oh yeah, you knew that they were up to their knees in mud, and some chaps were coming home with frostbite. I remember one of my uncles came home with bad, afterwards, TB and consumption. He was the youngest one of the lot, and I think he died somewhere around about 1918 or 19. Another one came home, and he had a bullet through both, or shrapnel or bullet through both legs. It had gone through one leg, one knee, and buried in the other knee. But and he came home and was in hospital blues for a while at Croydon, but he was invalided out of the army, and the amazing thing, he still is alive today, and has walked about all his life up till, I believe, the last few weeks. He doesn't walk about much now, I don't think.
Who is he?
My Uncle Ted. He lives at Wimbledon, up at Wimbledon, top of Wimbledon Hill.
You remember if other boys at school were having dreadful experiences in their family?
No, I can't recollect any, actually.
Were boys looking forward to when they could leave school and join up?
Oh, yes, yeah. Everyone tried to leave school as soon as they could. I recollect one lad, the family that lived very near us were Irish, and they were broad Irish. The mother herself was a real broad Irish woman that took snuff, and I believe took snuff all her life, and always had under her nostrils the marks of the snuff. But I know that one of their lads that I was very friendly with, we used to play together at night time and that sort of thing. They went to different schools to me, but we always used to play together. He left school when he was thinking that he was 14. He left school when he was 13, and his father got him a job up in London on the London County Council, running after horses, picking up the droppings, which was a favourite job of young lads in those days. And after he'd been doing this for a few months, they found out that he was only 13, and he had to pack up the job and went back to school again, much to his annoyance.
What did they do with the manure?
I don't know. It was for the council. I suppose they used to have a brush, what they call a brush and pan, you know, and they'd run into the road, scoop up this manure, and add a barrow with them, tip it into the barrow, and then it was taken to their, one of their areas, I suppose, and tipped or put onto the land. Whether it's collected up to the land or not, I don't know. Couldn't tell you what they did with it, but I know that was a favourite. It was everywhere in London you saw, I won't say prolific, but, say one chap, his job would be keeping Fleet Street clean. Another chap, his job would be keeping Queen Victoria Street clean. And another one would be Cannon Street clean, all that sort of thing. You know?
These weren't what they called crossing sweepers, were they?
No. They were boys.
Crossing sweepers?
Crossing sweepers would sweep the whole length and breadth of the roads and the pavements. They used to walk up and down the roads, sweeping the gutters and curbs and all that. And they'd move it into a pile. Every couple of 100 yards or 100 yards or so there would be a pile of dirt, and then they'd come round with a barrow and scoop it all up and or the dust cart would come along and they'd scoop it all up. But in those days, you must recollect that most things were, there was no, the motors weren't so prolific or anywhere near. It was mostly horse and cart trade. The baker's roundsman, the milkman, everyone that came round your house came and delivered bread to your door, milk to your door, and greengrocery and things like that. They would come round and deliver, but all in horse-drawn vehicles. Coal was all delivered to your door, but always in horse-drawn vehicles in those days.
Were you interested in motor vehicles? Like most boys are today?
No, I never have been much. Funny thing. Never have been a great deal interested in motors, even though I was MT in the army. MTO. I was MT officer of 2 different battalions. And I was never really interested in the mechanical side of motors. I've never been engineering ways or anything like
So
that.
you didn't really take much note of the cars and things?
No, not a great deal, no. Yeah. The war, of course, as it took place and was